4 empires walked into World War I. None of them walked out, and the map they left behind is still causing wars today. November 1918, the guns finally stopped firing after 4 years of hell. 20 million people were dead. But here's what nobody talks about. The real devastation wasn't just the body count, it was what happened to the empires that started the war. The Russian Empire, the Ottoman Empire, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and the German Empire, all of them gone. Vanished, erased from existence. Empires that had lasted for centuries, some for over 1,000 years, just ceased to exist within a few years. And in their place, politicians drew new borders on maps. They created new countries. They split up populations. They made promises they couldn't keep. And those decisions, made in hotel rooms in Paris by men who had never visited most of these places, are still causing conflicts over 100 years later. The wars in the Middle East, the breakup of Yugoslavia in the 90s, the tensions in Eastern Europe. All of it traces back to how the map was redrawn after World War I. This is the story nobody tells you about World War I. Not the battles, not the trenches, but what happened after. How the world was remade and why we're still living with the consequences. Let's start with the Russian Empire, because it was the first to fall, and its collapse was the most dramatic and violent. Russia didn't even make it to the end of the war. They collapsed in 1917, a full year before the fighting stopped, and the way Russia fell apart and what replaced it would change the entire course of the 20th century. The Russian Empire in 1914 was the largest country on Earth. It stretched from Poland in the west to the Pacific Ocean in the east, from the Arctic Ocean in the north to the borders of Afghanistan and China in the south. 11 time zones, over 8.5 million square miles. 1/6 of the world's land surface was controlled by the Russian Tsar. Over 170 million people lived under the rule of Tsar Nicholas II. But here's the thing about those 170 million people. They weren't one nation. They were dozens, maybe hundreds of different ethnic groups, languages, religions, and cultures all forced together under Russian imperial rule. You had ethnic Russians who made up about 45% of the population. Then you had Ukrainians, Poles, Finns, Estonians, Latvians, Lithuanians, Georgians, Armenians, Azerbaijanis, Uzbeks, Kazakhs, Tatars, Jews, Germans, and countless other groups. Over 100 different languages were spoken across the empire. Most of these people hadn't chosen to be part of Russia. Their lands had been conquered over centuries of Russian expansion. The Poles had lost their independence in the 1790s, when Poland was partitioned between Russia, Prussia, and Austria. Finland had been taken from Sweden in 1809. The Baltic provinces had been conquered earlier. The Caucasus region, including Georgia and Armenia, had been conquered in the early 1800s. Central Asia had been conquered later in the 1800s. These weren't willing members of a unified nation. They were conquered peoples held together by military force and autocratic rule. The Tsar ruled as an autocrat, meaning he had absolute power. Russia was one of the last absolute monarchies in Europe. There was no constitution limiting the Tsar's power. There was no real democracy. The Tsar's word was law, sake he could arrest anyone, censor anything, do basically whatever he wanted. This was called autocracy, and it was backed up by an enormous bureaucracy and secret police force that monitored and controlled the population. The Russian Orthodox Church supported the Tsar, teaching that he was appointed by God and that obedience to him was a religious duty. The nobility, who owned most of the land, supported the Tsar because he protected their privileges. The military supported the Tsar because they depended on him for their positions and status. This system had worked for centuries, but by 1914 it was breaking down. Russian society in 1914 was incredibly unequal and backward compared to Western Europe. The majority of the population, probably around 80%, were peasants. They lived in villages, farmed small plots of land, and lived much like their ancestors had for centuries. Most were illiterate. Most had never traveled more than a few miles from where they were born. They grew their own food, made their own clothes, lived in wooden houses, and followed the rhythms of agricultural life. Serfdom, which was basically slavery, had only been abolished in 1861. That's less than 60 years before World War I started. Millions of Russians alive in 1914 could remember being serfs, legally bound to the land and their masters. Even after emancipation, most peasants remained poor and oppressed. They had to pay redemption fees for decades to buy the land they had worked as serfs. Many remained in debt to their former masters or to the government. Russia had started industrializing in the late 1800s, but it was still way behind Western Europe. Cities like Moscow and St. Petersburg were growing rapidly. Factories were being built, railways were being constructed. But this industrialization created new problems. Factory workers lived in horrible conditions. worked 12 to 16-hour days, earned barely enough to survive, and had no rights. They couldn't form unions or strike without being arrested or shot. Industrial accidents were common. There was no workers' compensation or safety regulations. So you had this incredibly unequal society. At the top, a tiny elite of aristocrats and wealthy industrialists lived in luxury. They owned palaces, went to the opera, spoke French, traveled to Western Europe, lived like the richest people anywhere. In the middle, a small but growing middle class of professionals, merchants, and educated people wanted political reforms and more freedom. At the bottom, millions of peasants and workers who barely survived and who were becoming increasingly angry about their conditions. And holding all of this together was the Tsar, Nicholas II, who was completely unsuited for the job. Nicholas had become Tsar in 1894 when his father died suddenly. Nicholas was only 26. He had no real training or preparation. He was shy, indecisive, and believed absolutely in autocracy because he thought God had given him this responsibility. He refused to share power or make meaningful reforms because he thought that would be betraying his duty. Nicholas's wife, Alexandra, was even worse. She was German by birth, which made her unpopular. She was deeply religious and superstitious. She fell under the influence of Grigory Rasputin, a mystic and holy man who seemed to be able to help their son Alexei, who suffered from hemophilia. Rasputin gained enormous influence over Alexandra, who then influenced Nicholas. Rasputin's presence at court scandalized Russian society and made the royal family look foolish and out of touch. The empire had already nearly collapsed once. In 1905, there was a revolution after Russia lost a humiliating war to Japan. Workers went on strike across the country. Protesters demanded political reforms. The military shot down protesters on what became known as Bloody Sunday in January 1905. Hundreds were killed. This sparked more protests and strikes. Peasants seized land from nobles. Some military units mutinied. The most famous was the mutiny on the battleship Potemkin. For months, it looked like the Tsar might be overthrown. He survived by making promises and by using brutal force. In October 1905, he issued the October Manifesto, which promised civil liberties, a constitution, and a parliament called the Duma. This split the opposition. Moderate reformers accepted the promises and stopped protesting. This allowed the government to crush the radicals with military force. Thousands were executed or exiled to Siberia in what was called the Stolypin reaction, named after Prime Minister Pyotr Stolypin. But the promised reforms never really happened. The Tsar created the Duma, but he kept the power to dissolve it whenever he wanted. And he did, multiple times, whenever the Duma demanded real power or criticized his policies. The constitution was weak and could be overridden by the Tsar. Civil liberties were restricted again. Political parties that were too radical were banned. Secret police continued to monitor and arrest dissidents. So the 1905 revolution changed some things but left the fundamental problems unsolved. The empire remained autocratic, unequal, and unstable. And then World War I happened, and it exposed every weakness in the Russian system. Russia entered World War I in August 1914 to defend Serbia, which was being attacked by Austria-Hungary. Russia saw itself as the protector of Slavic peoples and Orthodox Christians. The Russian government also thought that a successful war would unite the country and strengthen the monarchy. They thought the military would win quickly and Russia would gain prestige and territory. They were catastrophically wrong. The Russian military was huge. Russia could mobilize millions of men. The Russian army in peacetime was already over 1 million men. When fully mobilized, it could field 5 or 6 million. This terrified Germany, which called it the Russian steamroller. This image of endless masses of Russian soldiers overwhelming enemies through sheer numbers. But size wasn't everything. The Russian military was poorly equipped, poorly trained, and poorly led. Many soldiers went to the front without proper rifles. There are documented cases of soldiers being told to pick up weapons from dead comrades. Ammunition was constantly in short supply. Artillery shells ran out during battles. Food supplies were inadequate. Medical care was primitive. The supply system was a disaster because Russia's railway network was underdeveloped compared to Germany's. Moving millions of men and tons of supplies across the vast distances of Russia required railways, and Russia didn't have nearly enough of them. Russian officers were often incompetent. Many came from aristocratic families and got their positions through connections rather than ability. They didn't understand modern warfare. They didn't care about their men, treating soldiers as expendable. Communication between officers and men was often difficult because officers spoke Russian, but soldiers might speak Ukrainian or Polish or any number of other languages. The results were predictable. In August 1914, Russia invaded East Prussia in an attempt to take pressure off France. 2 Russian armies advanced, but they weren't coordinated. German forces under Generals Hindenburg and Ludendorff destroyed one Russian army at the Battle of Tannenberg. Almost 200,000 Russian soldiers were killed or captured in a matter of days. The commanding general, Alexander Samsonov, committed suicide. It was one of the most complete military defeats in modern history. Things didn't get better. The Russians had some successes against Austria-Hungary, whose military was even worse than Russia's. But against Germany, Russia lost consistently. The Masurian Lakes, Gorlice Tarnov, the Great Retreat of 1915, where Russian forces had to abandon Poland and much of the Baltic region. Battle after battle, the Russians were beaten. Russian casualties were horrific. In the first year of the war alone, Russia lost over 1 million men killed or captured. By 1917, Russian casualties totaled somewhere between 7 and 9 million killed, wounded, or captured. The exact numbers are uncertain because record-keeping broke down, but we're talking about millions of men dead or maimed. Entire generations of young men from some villages were wiped out. The war destroyed the Russian economy. Russia was cut off from its allies by geography. The only way to get supplies to Russia was through Arkhangelsk in the Arctic, which was frozen much of the year, or through Vladivostok in the Pacific, which was thousands of miles from where they were needed. Russia couldn't get enough weapons or ammunition from its allies. Russian industry tried to produce what was needed, but couldn't keep up with demand. The government printed money to pay for the war, causing massive inflation. The value of the ruble plummeted. Prices skyrocketed. Workers' wages couldn't keep up with rising prices, so their living standards fell dramatically. Peasants had to give up their grain to feed the army, leaving them with barely enough to survive. The railway system was overwhelmed trying to move military supplies, so food couldn't get to the cities. By 1916, people in Moscow and St. Petersburg were standing in line for hours to buy bread, and often the shops ran out before everyone was served. The conscription system was brutal. Millions of peasants were drafted into the army. They left their farms, leaving women, children, and old men to do all the work. Agricultural production fell. Horses were taken for the military, making it even harder to farm. Villages lost their young men, who were their main labor force. And for what? The soldiers at the front were dying in huge numbers for battles that accomplished nothing. They took and lost the same ground repeatedly. Officers they didn't respect sent them on suicidal attacks. They didn't have enough ammunition to fight properly. They didn't have enough food. They didn't even have enough boots or warm clothes for the winter. Soldiers wrapped their feet in rags because they didn't have proper footwear. In the winter, thousands froze to death. By 1916, desertion was becoming common. Soldiers would just walk away from the front and go home. Some would hide in forests. Some would join bands of deserters who lived by robbery. The military tried to stop desertion with harsh punishments, including execution, but it kept happening because soldiers had lost faith in the war and the government. The home front was collapsing. Workers in the cities were starving and angry. They blamed the government for the food shortages and the endless war. They went on strike, demanding better conditions and political reforms. The government responded with force, arresting strike leaders and sending in Cossacks to break up protests. But the strikes kept happening and getting bigger. Peasants were becoming rebellious. They had given up their sons to the army and their grain to the government, and they were getting nothing in return except more demands. Rumors spread that the rich were hoarding food while the poor starved. Peasants started refusing to sell grain at the government's fixed prices and started hoarding it themselves, which made the food situation in cities even worse. The Tsar's government was seen as incompetent and possibly treasonous. Remember that the Tsarina Alexandra was German by birth. When the war against Germany started going badly, people started whispering that maybe she was a German spy, that she was deliberately sabotaging Russia's war effort to help Germany. This was nonsense, but it was widely believed. The fact that she relied on Rasputin, who was openly corrupt and used his influence to get his friends government positions, made things worse. In December 1916, a group of aristocrats murdered Rasputin. They lured him to a palace, poisoned him, shot him, and threw his body in the river. They thought killing Rasputin would somehow save the monarchy by removing this embarrassing figure. It didn't work. By that point, the problems were too deep for killing one person to fix. Tsar Nicholas had made things worse by going to military headquarters in 1915 and taking personal command of the army. This was a terrible decision. Nicholas had no military training or experience. He couldn't actually command effectively, so real decisions were still made by generals. But by taking nominal command, Nicholas became personally responsible for all the military defeats. Every lost battle was now the Tsar's fault. And while he was away at headquarters, Alexandra was left in charge in St. Petersburg, making political decisions while relying on Rasputin's advice. It was a disaster. By early 1917, Russia was on the edge of total collapse. The army had lost millions of men. The economy was destroyed. People in cities were starving. Workers were striking. Peasants were hoarding grain. Soldiers were deserting. The government was paralyzed and discredited. Something had to give. What finally broke everything was International Women's Day on March 8, 1917. Women, textile workers in Petrograd, as St. Petersburg had been renamed to sound less German, went on strike demanding bread. They marched through the streets chanting for food. Other workers joined them. The strike spread. Within a couple of days, over 200,000 workers were on strike in Petrograd. The whole city was paralyzed. The Tsar ordered the military to suppress the protests. Soldiers were sent into the streets to restore order. But here's where everything changed. The soldiers refused to fire on the protesters. In some cases, soldiers actually joined the protests. The Petrograd garrison, over 150,000 men, mutinied. They refused to obey orders. They turned their weapons against their officers in some cases. Without the military's support, the government couldn't control the situation. Within days, the Tsar had lost control of the capital. Revolutionary councils called Soviets were formed by workers and soldiers. The Duma, which the Tsar had tried to dissolve, refused to dissolve, and instead formed a provisional committee to take over the government. Russia suddenly had two competing centers of power, the provisional government formed by Duma politicians and the Petrograd Soviet formed by workers and soldiers. Nicholas's generals told him the situation was hopeless. The army wouldn't fight for him anymore. His own commanders advised him to abdicate. On March 15, 1917, Nicholas II abdicated. He tried to pass the throne to his brother Michael, but Michael refused to take it unless a democratic assembly invited him, which never happened. The Romanov dynasty, which had ruled Russia since 1613, was over, just like that. 300 years of history ended in a few days. The Russian Empire died with Nicholas's abdication. Russia was now supposed to be a democracy. A provisional government, led by Prince Georgy Lvov and later Alexander Kerensky, took control. They promised to establish democracy, protect civil liberties, continue the war alongside the Allies, and hold elections for a constituent assembly that would write a constitution and determine Russia's future. But the provisional government made a fatal mistake. They decided to keep fighting the war. This was political suicide. The Russian people were done with the war. Soldiers were done with the war. Workers were done with the war. Peasants were done with the war. Everyone wanted peace. But the provisional government felt they had obligations to Britain and France. They thought they had to keep their commitments to the Allies. They thought Russia had to stay in the war to defeat Germany and gain the territorial benefits that had been promised. So, the war continued. And Russian soldiers kept dying. And the economy kept collapsing. And food kept running out. And people got angrier and angrier at the provisional government for not ending the war. Meanwhile, the Soviets, the councils of workers and soldiers, were gaining power and influence. The most important was the Petrograd Soviet, which controlled the capital. But Soviets formed all over Russia in cities and at the front. They represented workers and soldiers directly and were more radical than the provisional government. The Soviets wanted peace immediately. They wanted land reform to give peasants the land they worked. They wanted workers' control of factories. They wanted revolutionary change, not just political reform. This created what was called dual power. The provisional government had legal authority but limited actual power. The Soviets had real influence with workers and soldiers but no legal authority. Russia had two governments that didn't agree on what to do. The situation couldn't last. Into this chaos came Vladimir Lenin. Lenin was a leader of the Bolshevik Party, a radical socialist group that wanted communist revolution. Lenin had been in exile in Switzerland during the war. When the revolution happened in March, he desperately wanted to get back to Russia, but getting from Switzerland to Russia meant crossing through Germany, and Russia and Germany were at war. The Germans made a deal with Lenin. They would allow him and other Bolshevik exiles to travel through Germany in a sealed train to Russia. Why would Germany do this? Because they knew Lenin wanted to pull Russia out of the war. If Lenin succeeded in taking power, Russia would make peace, and Germany could transfer all its forces from the Eastern Front to the Western Front. The Germans were basically sending Lenin to Russia like a virus, hoping he would destroy Russia's ability to fight. It worked better than they could have imagined. Lenin arrived in Petrograd in April 1917. He immediately called for peace, land redistribution, and all power to the Soviets. His slogan was simple and powerful: peace, land, and bread. This was what ordinary Russians wanted to hear, not complicated political theories. Just end the war, give peasants the land, and get food to people. The provisional government tried to continue business as usual. In July 1917, they launched a major military offensive against Austria and Germany. It was called the Kerensky Offensive after Alexander Kerensky, who was now leading the government. The offensive was a complete disaster. Russian soldiers, who had been promised the war would end soon, were furious at being sent into another attack. Entire units refused to fight. The offensive collapsed. Germans counterattacked and pushed Russian forces back. It was another humiliating defeat. This failure destroyed what little faith people had left in the provisional government. If they couldn't win the war, why were they continuing it? If they couldn't feed the people, why should anyone listen to them? The Bolsheviks, who had been calling for immediate peace all along, looked more and more like the only ones making sense. Through the summer and fall of 1917, Russia descended into chaos. Soldiers deserted by the hundreds of thousands and headed home. Many took their weapons with them. Peasants started seizing land from aristocrats, not waiting for the government to redistribute it officially. Workers took over factories. National minorities started demanding independence or autonomy. The Finns, the Poles, the Ukrainians all started forming their own governments. The empire was breaking apart. The provisional government was powerless to stop any of this. They had no military force they could rely on. Soldiers wouldn't follow orders from a government they didn't respect. The government couldn't feed the cities because peasants were hoarding grain. They couldn't maintain order because the police had been dissolved in the revolution and nothing had replaced them. The Bolsheviks spent these months organizing and building support. They were the most disciplined and organized political party, and they had a clear message: peace, land, and bread. They worked in the factories, in the military units, in the Soviets. By October, they had majorities in the most important Soviets, including Petrograd and Moscow. Lenin decided it was time to seize power. On November 6-7, 1917, which was October 24-25 according to Russia's old calendar, hence it's called the October Revolution, the Bolsheviks launched their coup. It was almost bloodless in Petrograd. Bolshevik-aligned soldiers and armed workers seized key locations: bridges, train stations, telegraph offices, government buildings. The provisional government, meeting in the Winter Palace, was arrested. Kerensky fled the city. Within a day, the Bolsheviks controlled Petrograd. Lenin immediately announced that the Bolsheviks were taking power in the name of the Soviets. He issued decrees giving peasants the land and beginning peace negotiations with Germany. The Bolsheviks claimed they were creating a government of workers and peasants, a socialist state that would transform Russia and inspire world revolution. But most of Russia didn't immediately accept Bolshevik rule. The Bolsheviks controlled Petrograd and Moscow, but most of the country was still controlled by other groups, or was just in chaos. Elections for the Constituent Assembly were held in November as planned. The Bolsheviks lost badly. The Socialist Revolutionary Party, which represented the peasants, won the majority. The Constituent Assembly met in January 1918. After one day, the Bolsheviks dissolved it by force. They weren't going to let democracy get in the way of their revolution. Lenin's first priority was ending the war. He sent negotiators to meet with Germany. The Germans demanded huge territorial concessions. Lenin's position was weak. The Russian army had essentially dissolved. Soldiers were going home. There was no organized military force that could resist Germany. Lenin had no choice but to accept Germany's terms. The Treaty of Brest-Litovsk was signed on March 3, 1918. It was one of the harshest peace treaties in modern history. Russia had to give up Poland, which was already occupied by Germany. They had to give up the Baltic provinces, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. They had to recognize Ukraine as independent, and Ukraine immediately fell under German influence. They had to give up Finland, which declared independence. They had to cede territory in the Caucasus to the Ottoman Empire, Turkey's ally. In total, Russia lost about 1 million square miles of territory. They lost a third of their population, around 60 million people. They lost a third of their agricultural land, the most fertile parts of the country. They lost 3/4 of their coal and iron ore deposits. They lost the majority of their industry because so much was concentrated in Poland and Ukraine. It was an absolutely devastating peace. Many Bolsheviks were horrified. How could they accept such terms? Lenin argued they had no choice. Russia needed peace at any cost to survive and consolidate the revolution. He said the territorial losses would be temporary. Once a socialist revolution spread to Germany and the rest of Europe, as Lenin expected it would, these borders would become irrelevant. The International Workers' Revolution would unite everyone. It sounded good in theory. In practice, socialist revolution didn't spread, and Russia was stuck with massive territorial losses. But even signing the treaty didn't bring peace to Russia. It brought civil war. The Russian Civil War, which lasted from 1918 to 1922, was one of the most brutal conflicts in history. It's estimated that between 7 and 12 million people died during the Civil War. more than Russia lost in World War I. Many died in battle, but more died from disease, famine, and terror campaigns by both sides. The Civil War was between the Reds, the Bolsheviks, and the Whites, a loose coalition of everyone who opposed the Bolsheviks. The Whites included monarchists who wanted to restore the Tsar. They included liberals who wanted democracy. They included moderate socialists who opposed Bolshevik dictatorship. They included military officers who wanted to restore order. They included nationalists from various ethnic groups who wanted independence. The Whites had nothing in common except opposition to the Bolsheviks, which made them hard to organize as a unified force. The Whites were supported by foreign intervention. Britain, France, the United States, and Japan all sent troops to Russia to support the Whites and try to overthrow the Bolsheviks. They feared communist revolution spreading to their own countries. They wanted Russia back in the war fighting Germany. They thought the Bolsheviks were illegitimate and dangerous. So they provided weapons, money, and troops to the Whites. The Civil War was fought across the vast territory of Russia. Different white armies operated in different regions. Admiral Kolchak led white forces in Siberia. General Denikin led forces in southern Russia. General Yudenich led forces trying to capture Petrograd from the northwest. The Whites controlled large territories at different points and seemed like they might win. But the Reds had crucial advantages. They controlled the central heartland of Russia, including Moscow and Petrograd. They controlled the railway hubs, which allowed them to move forces more efficiently. They had unified command under Leon Trotsky, who created the Red Army and led it brilliantly. The Whites, by contrast, were divided and often fighting among themselves. They couldn't coordinate their campaigns effectively. The Reds also had a clearer message. They told peasants they were fighting to keep the land they had seized from aristocrats. If the Whites won, the old landowners would come back and take the land away. This motivated peasants to support the Reds, or at least not support the Whites. The Whites, many of whom were aristocrats or supported by aristocrats, couldn't counter this message effectively. Both sides committed horrific atrocities. The Reds implemented a policy called war communism, which included forcibly seizing grain from peasants to feed the Red Army and urban workers. When peasants resisted, entire villages were massacred. The Cheka, the Bolshevik secret police, arrested and executed anyone suspected of opposing the revolution. This was called the Red Terror. Tens of thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands, were executed without trial. The Whites committed similar atrocities. They massacred Bolshevik supporters. They carried out pogroms against Jews, who they blamed for the revolution. The White forces led by General Denikin killed somewhere between 50,000 and 200,000 Jews in Ukraine alone. When Whites recaptured areas that had been under Red control, they executed anyone who had cooperated with the Bolsheviks. In July 1918, White forces were advancing toward the Urals, where the Tsar and his family were being held prisoner. The local Bolsheviks decided they couldn't let the Whites rescue the Tsar and use him as a rallying point. On the night of July 16, 17, Tsar Nicholas, his wife Alexandra, their 5 children and several servants were taken to a basement and executed by firing squad. The bodies were hidden, and the location kept secret for decades. The Romanov dynasty ended not just politically but literally, with the murder of the entire royal family. The Civil War raged for 4 years. Foreign intervention mostly ended by 1920, as Britain, France, and the United States lost interest and withdrew their troops. But fighting continued between the Reds and various white armies, and between the Bolsheviks and nationalist movements in different parts of the former empire. By 1922, the Bolsheviks had won. The white armies were defeated or had fled into exile. The Red Army controlled most of the territory of the former Russian Empire, though with significant losses. Poland had become independent. Finland was independent. The Baltic states of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania were independent, but Ukraine, Belarus, the Caucasus, and Central Asia were brought back under control, though often with brutal force. In December 1922, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics was formally established. The Soviet Union was officially a federation of republics: Russia, Ukraine, Belarus, and the Transcaucasian Federation, which included Georgia, Armenia, and Azerbaijan. Later, the Central Asian republics would be added. Each republic was theoretically autonomous, but in reality, everything was controlled by the Communist Party from Moscow. It was the Russian Empire under a different name and with a different ideology. The cost of the revolution and civil war was staggering. World War I had killed maybe 3 million Russians. The Civil War killed 7 to 12 million more. The Russian economy was utterly destroyed. Industrial production in 1921 was about 20% of what it had been in 1913. Agricultural production had collapsed because of the chaos and forced grain seizures. Famine in 1921-1922 killed around 5 million people. People were so desperate they resorted to cannibalism in some areas. The population had fallen dramatically, not just from death, but from emigration. Between 1 and 2 million Russians fled abroad during the Revolution and Civil War. They included aristocrats, military officers, intellectuals, artists, professionals, anyone who could escape and didn't want to live under communist rule. They spread across Europe and beyond, creating Russian exile communities in Paris, Berlin, Prague, Shanghai, and other cities. These Russian émigrés kept Russian culture alive outside Russia, but also meant that Russia lost many of its most educated and talented people. The Bolsheviks, now calling themselves the Communist Party, established a totalitarian state. All other political parties were banned. The press was controlled by the state. Private property was abolished, with everything owned by the state or collectives. The secret police, reorganized as the GPU, and later the NKVD and KGB, monitored and controlled the population. Dissent was crushed brutally. Labor camps called gulags were established where political prisoners and other enemies of the state were sent to work, often in terrible conditions in Siberia. Vladimir Lenin led the Soviet Union until his death in 1924. He was succeeded by Joseph Stalin after a power struggle with Leon Trotsky and others. Stalin would rule until 1953 and would be even more brutal than Lenin. Stalin's collectivization of agriculture in the late 1920s and early 1930s caused another famine that killed millions, particularly in Ukraine. Stalin's purges in the 1930s saw hundreds of thousands executed and millions sent to the gulags. The Soviet Union under Stalin became one of the most repressive and deadly regimes in history. But the Soviet Union was also powerful. By the 1930s, the Soviet economy had recovered and was growing rapidly through forced industrialization. The Soviet Union became a major military power. During World War II, the Soviet Union bore the brunt of fighting against Nazi Germany and suffered around 27 million deaths but emerged victorious. After World War II, the Soviet Union became a superpower, controlling Eastern Europe and competing with the United States in the Cold War. The Soviet Union would last until 1991, when it finally collapsed. The reasons were complex, but fundamentally, the communist economic system didn't work, and the totalitarian political system couldn't adapt to changing times. When Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev tried to reform the system in the 1980s, it all came apart. The Communist Party lost its monopoly on power. The republics started declaring independence. On December 25, 1991, the Soviet Union officially ceased to exist. The Russian Empire had become the Soviet Union in 1922. The Soviet Union became 15 independent countries in 1991, and here's where the map redrawing after World War I becomes relevant again. Many of the borders of the post-Soviet states were drawn during the Soviet period, which was itself based on how the map was redrawn after World War I and the Russian Civil War. Russia remained the largest country on Earth, but lost territory it had controlled for decades or centuries. Ukraine became independent, but with contested borders and a large Russian-speaking population, especially in Crimea and eastern Ukraine. This would lead to conflict in 2014 when Russia annexed Crimea and supported separatists in eastern Ukraine, and again in 2022 when Russia invaded Ukraine. The Baltic states of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, which had been independent after World War I but were annexed by the Soviet Union in 1940, became independent again. They quickly joined NATO and the European Union to protect themselves from potential Russian aggression. And their relationship with Russia remains tense because of the Russian minorities living in these countries and Russia's resentment at losing control over them. Belarus became independent but remained closely tied to Russia. Georgia, Armenia, and Azerbaijan became independent, but all three faced territorial conflicts. Georgia had breakaway regions in Abkhazia and South Ossetia that Russia supported. Armenia and Azerbaijan fought a war over Nagorno-Karabakh, a region that was mostly Armenian but had been assigned to Azerbaijan by Stalin. This conflict, which started in the late 1980s, has flared up repeatedly, most recently in 2020. The Central Asian republics of Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, Kyrgyzstan, and Tajikistan all became independent. These countries had been conquered by Russia in the 1800s and had never really been independent states before. And they struggled with building national identities and democratic institutions. Many became authoritarian states. They all had to negotiate relationships with Russia, which still saw Central Asia as its sphere of influence. So the collapse of the Russian Empire that began in 1917 created a pattern of territorial changes and conflicts that continued throughout the 20th century and into the 21st. The Soviet Union tried to reassemble most of the old empire under communist ideology. When the Soviet Union collapsed, many of the old ethnic and territorial conflicts resurfaced. The lesson from Russia's collapse is that empires don't just disappear quietly. When they fall, they create chaos, violence, and lasting instability. The Russian Empire's fall led to civil war that killed millions. It led to the creation of the Soviet Union, which was one of the most powerful and repressive states in history. The Soviet Union's fall led to new countries with contested borders and identities, some of which are still sources of conflict today. The borders drawn after World War I, when Poland, Finland, and the Baltic states became independent, set precedents and created expectations. When these countries lost their independence to the Soviet Union in 1940, during World War II, they never forgot that. They had been independent. The memory of those brief decades of freedom between 1918 and 1940 sustained their national identities through 50 years of Soviet occupation. When the Soviet Union collapsed, they immediately reasserted their independence, citing their status as independent states that had been illegally annexed. The borders drawn in 1918-1920 became the basis for the borders re-established in 1991. Now, let's talk about the Ottoman Empire, because its collapse created problems we're still dealing with today, perhaps even more directly than Russia's collapse. The Ottoman Empire in 1914 was already called the sick man of Europe. It had been declining for over a century. Territory after territory had broken away or been conquered by European powers. Greece had gained independence in the 1820s. Egypt was effectively under British control since 1882. The Balkans had been almost entirely lost in a series of wars in the 1800s and early 1900s. The empire had gone from being one of the most powerful states in the world to barely surviving. But the empire was still huge. It controlled modern-day Turkey, Syria, Iraq, Palestine, Jordan, parts of Arabia, including the holy cities of Mecca and Medina, and parts of North Africa, including Libya and areas around the Red Sea. Millions of people lived under Ottoman rule. The population was incredibly diverse: Turks, Arabs, Kurds, Armenians, Greeks, Jews, Assyrians, and many other groups. The empire was multi-ethnic and multi-religious, held together by the Ottoman dynasty and the Sultan's authority as both political ruler and, since the 1500s, Caliph of Islam. When World War I started, the Ottoman Empire made a fateful decision. They allied with Germany and Austria-Hungary against Britain, France, and Russia. This wasn't inevitable. The Ottoman Empire could have stayed neutral. Some Ottoman leaders wanted to join the Allies, but the dominant faction, led by Enver Pasha, believed Germany would win. They wanted to be on the winning side to regain lost territories and restore the empire's strength. They also feared Russia, which had been expanding into Ottoman territory for centuries, and wanted control of Constantinople and the straits connecting the Black Sea to the Mediterranean. So, in November 1914, the Ottoman Empire entered the war on Germany's side. It was a gamble, and it was the wrong gamble. The Ottomans would fight on multiple fronts, lose almost every campaign, and ultimately lose the entire empire except for the Turkish heartland. The Ottomans fought against Russia in the Caucasus. This campaign started with an Ottoman offensive in winter 1914-1915 that was a complete disaster. Ottoman forces were caught in the mountains in terrible weather. They froze to death by the thousands. The Russians counterattacked and pushed deep into Ottoman territory. The Ottoman position in the Caucasus never recovered. The Ottomans fought against Britain in Mesopotamia, modern Iraq. British and Indian forces invaded from the Persian Gulf, aiming to capture Baghdad and protect British oil interests in Persia. The Ottomans initially had some success, besieging and capturing a British force at Kut in 1916, but eventually British forces were reinforced and pushed north. Baghdad fell in March 1917. By the end of the war, Britain controlled all of Mesopotamia. The Ottomans fought against Britain in Palestine and Syria. British forces under General Edmund Allenby invaded from Egypt. The campaign was slow at first, but by late 1917, British forces had captured Jerusalem, which was a huge symbolic victory. By September 1918, British forces had broken through Ottoman defenses and were advancing rapidly into Syria. Damascus fell in October 1918, just before the war ended. The Ottomans fought against British and French forces at Gallipoli. This was actually an Ottoman success. The Allies tried to force the Dardanelles Straits, capture Constantinople, and knock the Ottoman Empire out of the war quickly. The campaign lasted from April 1915 to January 1916. Ottoman forces, commanded by Mustafa Kemal, who would later become Ataturk, successfully defended Gallipoli. The Allies suffered heavy casualties and eventually withdrew. It was one of the greatest Ottoman victories, but it was defensive and didn't change the overall strategic situation. And the Ottomans faced internal rebellion. The Arab Revolt, which started in June 1916, saw Arab forces under Faisal, son of the Sharif of Mecca, rebel against Ottoman rule. The British supported the revolt with weapons, money, and advisors, including T.E. Lawrence, who became famous as Lawrence of Arabia. The Arab forces fought a guerrilla campaign, attacking Ottoman supply lines, capturing strategic locations, and eventually helping British forces advance into Syria. The war was devastating for the Ottoman Empire. The economy collapsed. Famine killed hundreds of thousands of people. Diseases like typhus and cholera spread. The government's authority broke down in many areas, and in the chaos of the war, the Ottoman government committed genocide against the Armenians. The Armenian genocide began in April 1915. The Ottoman government, led by the Committee of Union and Progress, or Young Turks, decided to eliminate the Armenian population. Armenians were a Christian minority living primarily in eastern Anatolia. The Ottoman government claimed Armenians were disloyal and might support Russia, which was Christian and had promised to protect Ottoman Christians. There had been Armenian nationalist movements demanding autonomy or independence, which the Ottoman government saw as a threat to the empire's integrity. What followed was systematic extermination. Armenian men were rounded up and executed. Armenian women, children, and old people were force-marched into the Syrian desert without food, water, or shelter. Many died on the marches. Those who survived were left in the desert to die. Entire Armenian communities were wiped out. Churches were destroyed. Armenian property was confiscated. The Ottoman government's goal was to eliminate Armenians from Anatolia entirely. Over 1 million Armenians were killed between 1915 and 1923. Some estimates go as high as 1.5 million. It was one of the first genocides of the 20th century. The Armenian genocide became a model for later genocides, including the Holocaust. Hitler is reported to have said, "Who, after all, speaks today of the annihilation of the Armenians," when planning the Holocaust, suggesting that genocides could be carried out without lasting consequences. The Ottoman government denied then, and the Turkish government denies now that the Armenian genocide was genocide. They claim it was a civil war, that Armenians rebelled and were relocated for security reasons, that deaths were incidental to war and disease rather than deliberate extermination, but the historical evidence is overwhelming. It was a deliberate, systematic attempt to eliminate the Armenian population from Anatolia. Survivors and witnesses documented what happened. Ottoman telegrams and documents show government involvement in planning the killings. The Armenian genocide created a diaspora. Armenians who survived fled to Russia, the Middle East, Europe, and the Americas. Armenian communities formed in places like Lebanon, Syria, France, and the United States. These diaspora communities kept the memory of the genocide alive and demanded recognition and justice. The question of whether to recognize the Armenian genocide as genocide has become a political issue. Many countries, including France, Russia, and Canada, recognize it. The United States officially recognized it in 2021. Turkey still refuses to recognize it and pressures other countries not to recognize it. By 1918, the Ottoman Empire was falling apart completely. British forces had captured Jerusalem, Baghdad, and Damascus. Arab forces controlled the Arabian Peninsula. The Caucasus was lost to Russia and then to local independence movements after Russia collapsed. Greece was threatening western Anatolia. The empire had lost all its Arab territories and was on the verge of losing everything. When the war ended with the armistice in October 1918, the Ottoman Empire was defeated and occupied. Allied forces controlled Constantinople. The Sultan was powerless, essentially a puppet of the occupying powers. The Ottoman government signed the Armistice of Mudros, agreeing to demobilize the Ottoman army, hand over strategic locations, and allow Allied occupation. And then came the Treaty of Sèvres in August 1920, which tried to carve up what was left of the Ottoman Empire. This treaty is important because it shows what the Allied powers wanted to do to the Ottoman Empire, even though it was never fully implemented. The Treaty of Sèvres would have reduced Turkey to a small state in central Anatolia. Western Anatolia, including the city of Smyrna, which is now Izmir, would go to Greece. Eastern Anatolia would be divided between an independent Armenia and an autonomous Kurdistan. The Straits Zone around Constantinople would be internationalized. Italy would get zones of influence in southern Anatolia. France would control Cilicia and southeastern Anatolia. Britain would control Mesopotamia and Palestine as mandates. Arabia would be independent under local rulers. What this meant is that Turkey would lose almost everything. The Ottoman Empire would be completely dismantled. Even the Turkish heartland would be divided. The Turks would be left with a rump state that included less than half of Anatolia, and even Constantinople, the capital of the Ottoman Empire for 5 centuries, would be under international control. The Treaty of Sèvres was never implemented because Turkish nationalists, led by Mustafa Kemal, refused to accept it. Kemal had been a successful military commander during the war. He had defended Gallipoli. He had led forces in Syria and the Caucasus. He was a national hero. When the Ottoman government signed the Treaty of Sèvres, Kemal and other nationalists rejected it entirely. Kemal organized a Turkish national movement based in Ankara, in the interior of Anatolia. He created a new government, the Grand National Assembly, that claimed to be the legitimate government of Turkey. He organized a new Turkish army from the remnants of the Ottoman military and from volunteers, and he prepared to fight to defend Turkish territory. The Turkish War of Independence lasted from 1919 to 1923. Turkish forces fought on multiple fronts. They fought against Greek forces that had occupied western Anatolia. This was the most important front. Greece, with Allied support, had invaded western Anatolia and was advancing inland. The Greeks aimed to create a greater Greece that included western Anatolia, which had significant Greek populations in cities like Smyrna. The Greco-Turkish War was brutal. Both sides committed atrocities. Greek forces burned Turkish villages. Turkish forces massacred Greek civilians. The war went back and forth for a while, but eventually Turkish forces under Kemal launched a major offensive in August 1922. They broke through Greek lines, routed the Greek army, and advanced to the coast. The Greeks evacuated Smyrna in September 1922. As they left, Smyrna burned. Who started the fire is disputed, but it destroyed the city and killed thousands of Greek and Armenian civilians who were trying to evacuate. The Turkish victory over Greece was complete. Greek forces were expelled from Anatolia. This led to a massive population exchange. About 1.5 million Greeks living in Anatolia were forced to leave and move to Greece. About 500,000 Muslims living in Greece were forced to leave and move to Turkey. This was one of the first large-scale forced population transfers in modern history. Communities that had lived in these places for thousands of years were uprooted and moved to countries they had never lived in. It solved the ethnic conflict by separating the populations, but at an enormous human cost. Turkish forces also fought against Armenian forces in the east. The Republic of Armenia, which had been established after Russia collapsed, tried to hold territory in eastern Anatolia that had been promised to them by the Treaty of Sèvres. Turkish forces attacked and defeated them. Armenia was forced to accept a treaty that gave up territorial claims in Anatolia. The dream of an independent Armenia, including eastern Anatolia, was dead. Armenia itself would soon be absorbed into the Soviet Union. Turkish forces fought against French forces in Cilicia, southeastern Anatolia. France had occupied this region and was supposed to control it as a sphere of influence under the Treaty of Sèvres. But Turkish resistance was strong, and France decided the territory wasn't worth fighting for. France withdrew and signed an agreement recognizing Turkish sovereignty over Cilicia. Turkish forces secured the eastern border against what remained of Armenia and against potential Soviet expansion. They negotiated with the Soviet Union, which was willing to support Turkish nationalists as a way of opposing the Western powers. The Soviets provided weapons and money to the Turkish nationalists. By 1922, Turkish forces had won. They controlled Anatolia. They had expelled foreign forces. The Allied occupation of Constantinople became untenable. In November 1922, the Grand National Assembly in Ankara voted to abolish the Sultanate. Mehmed VI, the last Ottoman Sultan, fled Constantinople on a British warship. The Ottoman dynasty, which had ruled for over 600 years, was over. The empire was formally abolished. In 1923, the Allies agreed to negotiate a new treaty. The Treaty of Lausanne, signed in July 1923, replaced the Treaty of Sèvres. The Treaty of Lausanne recognized the modern borders of Turkey, including all of Anatolia and eastern Thrace in Europe. Turkey kept Constantinople, now officially renamed Istanbul. The internationalization of the Straits was modified to give Turkey more control. There would be no Armenian state. There would be no Kurdish autonomy. Turkey was recognized as a fully independent country. In October 1923, the Republic of Turkey was officially proclaimed. Mustafa Kemal became its first president. In 1934, he would be given the surname Ataturk, meaning Father of the Turks. Ataturk would transform Turkey into a secular modern nation-state. He abolished the caliphate in 1924, separating religion from the state. He reformed the legal system, replacing Islamic law with European-style legal codes. He gave women the right to vote and hold office. He changed the alphabet from Arabic script to Latin script. He promoted Turkish nationalism and modernization. He created a new national identity based on Turkish ethnicity rather than Islamic identity or Ottoman imperial tradition. The creation of the Turkish Republic was one of the few success stories to come out of the collapse of empires after World War I. Turkey managed to resist partition, maintain its independence, and build a relatively stable nation-state. But even this success came at a huge cost. The Armenian genocide had eliminated the Armenian population. The population exchange had eliminated most Greeks. Kurds and other minorities were suppressed in the name of building a unified Turkish nation. Turkey would struggle throughout the 20th century with the question of Kurdish rights, leading to decades of conflict with Kurdish separatist movements. But at least Turkey survived as an independent state. The Arab territories of the Ottoman Empire weren't so lucky. They were divided up between Britain and France as mandates under the League of Nations. This is where things get really messy and really consequential for today's world. The Sykes-Picot Agreement, a secret deal between Britain and France made during the war in 1916, had already planned how to divide up the Ottoman Empire's Arab lands. Mark Sykes, a British diplomat, and François-Georges Picot, a French diplomat, met and drew lines on a map. France would get Syria and Lebanon, Britain would get Mesopotamia, which they called Iraq and Palestine. There would also be an international zone around Jerusalem and some areas of influence in between. They drew these lines with little regard for the people living there. They weren't thinking about ethnic groups or religious divisions or geographic realities or tribal boundaries. They were thinking about European strategic interests. France wanted Syria because they had historical ties to the Christian communities there and wanted influence in the region. Britain wanted Iraq because of oil and because it connected their territories in the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean. Britain wanted Palestine because it controlled the route to the Suez Canal in Egypt, which was vital to British interests. These weren't natural countries. These were artificial creations designed to serve British and French interests. Iraq was created by combining 3 Ottoman provinces, Basra, Baghdad, and Mosul, that had never been one country before. They had different populations, different economies, different histories. Basra in the south was mostly Shia Arab. Baghdad in the center was mixed Sunni and Shia. Mosul in the north was mixed Arab and Kurdish. These regions had been separate administrative units under the Ottomans for good reasons. Combining them into one country called Iraq was arbitrary. Syria and Lebanon were one region under the Ottomans. They were separated by the French to create a Christian-majority Lebanon that would be pro-French. Lebanon was carved out of Syria to include most of the Christian population, though it also included significant Muslim populations. This created a delicate religious balance that would eventually lead to civil war. Syria was left as a majority Sunni Muslim country, but with significant minorities including Christians, Druze, and Alawites. Jordan didn't even exist as a concept before the British created it. It was called Transjordan, meaning across the Jordan River from Palestine. It was basically invented as a consolation prize for Faisal, who had led the Arab Revolt. Faisal had been promised he would be king of Syria. He was briefly made king of Syria by an Arab nationalist Congress in 1920, but the French didn't accept this and kicked him out. So the British made him king of Iraq instead. His brother Abdullah was made king of Transjordan. Both were from the Hashemite family, descendants of the Prophet Muhammad, who had been rulers of the Hijaz region in Arabia. They had no previous connection to Iraq or Jordan. They were put there by the British to rule over populations that didn't know them. Palestine became the most complicated situation of all. During World War I, the British made contradictory promises to different groups, and the consequences of those contradictions are still causing conflict today. The British made promises to the Arabs through the Hussein-McMahon Correspondence in 1915-1916. Hussein was the Sheriff of Mecca, the leader of the Hashemite family. The British promised him that if he rebelled against the Ottomans, Britain would support Arab independence in a large area, including most of the Arab territories of the Ottoman Empire. The exact boundaries were left vague, and there was later dispute about whether Palestine was included in this promised area. But Arabs understood they were being promised independence, including Palestine, and the British made promises to the Zionists through the Balfour Declaration in November 1917. Arthur Balfour, the British Foreign Secretary, sent a letter to Lord Rothschild, a leader of the British Jewish community, stating that the British government viewed with favor the establishment of a national home for the Jewish people in Palestine. This promised Jews a homeland in Palestine. The declaration included language about not prejudicing the civil and religious rights of non-Jewish communities in Palestine, but it was vague about how a Jewish national home could be created without affecting the Arab majority already living there. And the British made secret agreements with the French through Sykes-Picot about dividing up the region between European powers. So, Britain had promised Arabs independence, promised Jews a homeland, and promised France they would divide the region between them. These 3 promises couldn't all be kept simultaneously. The British ended up with a League of Nations mandate over Palestine, meaning they were supposed to administer it temporarily until it could become independent, but they couldn't figure out how to create a Jewish national home while also protecting the rights of the Arab population. Jewish immigration increased, especially as persecution in Europe got worse in the 1920s and 1930s. Arab Palestinians felt betrayed. They had been promised independence, and instead they got continued foreign rule and an influx of Jewish immigrants who they feared would displace them. Tensions grew throughout the 1920s and 1930s. There were riots and violence. The Arab Revolt of 1936 and 1939 saw Palestinian Arabs rebel against British rule and Jewish immigration. The British crushed the revolt with brutal force, but the underlying problems remained unresolved. Britain proposed various partition plans, trying to divide Palestine between Jews and Arabs, but neither side accepted them. World War II made everything worse. The Holocaust killed 6 million Jews in Europe. Survivors desperately wanted to leave Europe, and many wanted to go to Palestine. But Britain, worried about Arab opposition, limited Jewish immigration. Jewish groups in Palestine, including armed groups like the Irgun and the Stern Gang, fought against British rule and Arab resistance. Arabs feared they were being displaced in their own land. Britain couldn't find a solution that satisfied anyone. In 1947, exhausted and facing its own post-war economic crisis, Britain gave up. They handed the problem to the newly created United Nations. The UN proposed partitioning Palestine into separate Jewish and Arab states, with Jerusalem under international control. Jews accepted the plan, though many wanted more territory. Arabs rejected it entirely, saying they were being forced to give up their land to create a state for European refugees whose persecution had nothing to do with Palestinians. When Britain withdrew in May 1948, Jews immediately declared the establishment of Israel. Arab states, including Egypt, Jordan, Syria, and Iraq, invaded to prevent Israel's creation. The 1948 Arab-Israeli War lasted about a year. Israel won, defeating the Arab armies and actually expanding beyond the UN partition plan boundaries. During the war, around 700,000 Palestinian Arabs became refugees, either fleeing the fighting or being expelled by Israeli forces. This event is called the Nakba, the catastrophe, by Palestinians. It's the defining tragedy of Palestinian history. The refugees fled or were driven to the West Bank, Gaza Strip, and neighboring Arab countries including Jordan, Lebanon, and Syria. They lived in refugee camps that were supposed to be temporary but are still there over 70 years later. The Palestinian refugee issue remains one of the core unresolved problems of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Palestinians demand the right of return to their homes. Israel refuses, saying accepting millions of Palestinian refugees would destroy Israel as a Jewish state. The conflict has continued for over 70 years with no resolution in sight, and all of this traces back directly to how the Ottoman Empire was carved up after World War I. Hit subscribe for more history that matters.